We all know what a sophist is, right? Someone who's all about winning an argument, more into clever tricks with words than actually getting to the truth.
Yeah, like a kind of intellectual con artist.
Yeah.
And that image, the sophist, as this, well, slippery character, that really comes down to us from Plato.
And you have to wonder, has that negative view, the one Plato gave us, has it kind of obscured a more, I don't know, a more complex and maybe even more interesting reality about these guys, like who they really were and what they were up to?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at in this deep dive. We're going to be focusing specifically on the sophists. And the main source we'll be using for this is the really comprehensive entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Right. The Stanford Encyclopedia, that's a great place to start. It's super scholarly, they've done their homework. And they're drawing from all sorts of stuff, like fragments of what the sophists themselves actually wrote.
Yeah. Plus accounts from people who lived at the same time, even those who weren't exactly fans, like Plato and Aristotle.
So this deep dive is kind of like a chance to, for people who are really into philosophy, to get past that dismissive view of the sophists and really understand these figures.
Right, to unpack who they were, what they actually did, and why their stuff, their contributions, are still relevant to philosophical discussions today.
Okay, I'm into it. Let's dive in. So first things first, what does it even mean to be a sophist? I mean, it wasn't always a bad word, was it?
Well, the word itself is interesting. The word sophistus comes from Sophia, which basically means wisdom or learning.
Okay, so it's about wisdom.
So in the beginning, a sophistess was just someone who, practiced wisdom or learning, a wise person, an expert in something.
So not necessarily a trickster, more like someone who actually knew their stuff.
Exactly, like a craftsman who is really skilled, or a poet, or even like a seer.
Interesting.
But things started to change in the 5th century BCE. That's when the meaning of the word sophist really shifted. I mean, it still had that broader meaning, but it started to be used specifically for a new type of person.
Okay. What kind of person?
Professional educators.
Like teachers.
Right. Teachers who traveled around, all over the Greek world and taught various subjects for a fee. It was like a whole new profession.
So it went from wisdom being something you just had to wisdom being something you could teach and learn?
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It shows you how the value placed on knowledge was changing at the time.
Traveling teachers, huh? That's pretty cool. Why were these guys even in demand, though? What was going on in society that made people want to hire them?
Well, there were all these changes happening at the same time. Social, economic, political, you name it. Especially in Athens.
Like what?
Well, Greek cities were getting wealthier. People were becoming more intellectually sophisticated. So naturally, they wanted more education.
More than just the basics, like reading and writing and stuff.
Right. They wanted to go beyond that. People were getting interested in those early Greek theories about nature, what we call the pre-Socratic philosophers.
Ah, yeah. Those guys.
But the sophists, they went even further. They were into history, geography, theories about civilization, all sorts of things.
So they were kind of like bringing these big ideas to a wider audience.
Yeah, you could say that.
But it wasn't just about, like, intellectual curiosity, was it?
Not entirely, no.
Yeah.
There were also practical reasons for this demand for higher education. For example, democracy was on the rise, especially in Athens.
Right, democracy.
And with democracy comes the need for, well, public speaking skills. People needed to be able to debate, to argue their case in court, all that.
Ah, so that's where rhetoric and persuasion come in.
Exactly. The sophists, they saw this need, and they stepped up to fill it. They developed techniques for effective argumentation, ways to persuade people.
So they were teaching people how to win arguments.
Well, it wasn't quite that simple. It's important to remember that this was also a time of huge intellectual ferment.
What do you mean by that?
People were questioning everything, traditional ideas about morality, religion, politics. And the sophists, they were part of this.
They weren't just, like, passively teaching techniques then.
No, they were actively involved in these debates. They were exploring new ideas, new perspectives.
So it wasn't just about winning, it was about engaging with these fundamental questions.
That's right.
That's really interesting. Okay, so they weren't just rhetoricians. They were more like, I don't know, public intellectuals engaging with the big issues of their day.
I think that's a good way to see them. Now, another thing that's really important to understand, especially if we're looking at them as philosophers, is that they weren't a unified group.
What do you mean?
They weren't like a school of thought with a specific doctrine. Each sophist was an individual. Yeah.
Right, so they each had their own thing going on.
Exactly. They weren't part of any organization. They didn't have a shared set of beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And They didn't found schools in the way that, say, Plato or Aristotle did later on.
So when we talk about the Sophists, we're really talking about a bunch of different individuals, each with their own unique approach. Okay, so we've got a sense of their origins, why they were in demand, and the fact that they were very much individuals. But as we said at the beginning, they haven't exactly been treated well by history, at least not within philosophy.
Yeah, that's true.
Why is that? Why do they have this negative reputation?
Well, it really comes down to Plato. Plato went to a lot of effort to distinguish philosophers,
Yeah.
especially his teacher Socrates, from the Sophists. He really wanted to make sure people didn't lump them together.
Like he had it out for them.
In a way, yes. A lot of what we know about the Sophists actually comes from Plato's dialogues. Dialogues like the Protagoras, the Gorgias, the Euthydemus, even the Republic. Oh, and of course there's the dialogue called Sophist.
Right. Plato was very influential.
Yeah. But it's also interesting to note that Plato's portrayal of the Sophists isn't entirely negative. I mean, he clearly recognized how smart and influential figures like Protagoras and Gorgias were.
So even in his critique, Plato was showing how important they were.
Definitely. Plus, it wasn't just Plato who was engaging with their ideas. Other writers from that time, people like Democritus, Euripides, and Thucydides, they were all grappling with sophistic thought in their own work.
So they were a major force in the intellectual landscape.
Without a doubt.
Okay. So we've talked about rhetoric and persuasion. What other areas did they explore?
Oh, they were into all sorts of things. I mean, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry lists, all these areas where they made contributions.
Like what?
Ethics, political philosophy, social philosophy, anthropology, the studies human nature and society. They were even into logic, dialectic, mathematics, the study of language and grammar. And they did literary criticism, rhetoric, of course, and even explored ideas about the gods and religion.
Wow, that's quite a list.
They were true polymaths, a lot of them, grappling with all the big questions.
It sounds like they were laying the groundwork for what would later become the different branches of philosophy.
You could say that. And unfortunately, much of what they wrote has been lost. So we have to rely on fragments and accounts from other people, often their critics, to piece together what they actually thought.
Right. Makes it a bit tricky. And because they weren't a unified group, there's no official list of who was and wasn't a sophist.
Exactly. There's no canon of sophists.
But there are some names that pop up again and again, especially in Plato, right?
Yeah, there are some key figures. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry highlights a few of them. People like Protagoras of Abdera, Gorgias of Leontini, Hippias, Prodicus, and Thrasymachus.
Ah, yes, those names are familiar, mostly from reading Plato. Maybe we could take a closer look at a few of them, explore their ideas in more detail.
Sure, let's do that.
Okay, let's start with Protagoras. He's often seen as one of the most important sophists.
Yeah, Protagoras was a big deal. He lived from around 490 to 420 BCE. And in Plato's dialogue, the Protagoras, he claims to teach something called sound deliberation. That's eubulia in Greek.
Sound deliberation, what does that mean exactly?
It's basically about good judgment, practical wisdom,
Oh.
knowing how to manage your own affairs and public affairs as well.
So how to be a successful citizen.
Yeah, how to live a good life, how to navigate the complexities of life in the city.
Interesting. So how did he go about teaching this sound deliberation?
Well, in the Protagoras, he gives this famous speech, the Great Speech, where he talks about how human civilization developed.
So he's got a theory about, the history of society.
Right. And his point is that justice and self-restraint are essential for a good society. Because, without these qualities, society just falls apart.
So he's saying that morality is important for survival.
Yeah, it's a kind of pragmatic approach to morality. And it's likely that this kind of story about social evolution and the need for civic virtue was a key part of his teaching.
Okay, so he was into social and political thought.
Yes, but he was also a pioneer in linguistics and literary theory.
Wow. Linguistics.
He wrote about the correct use of language. He developed a system for classifying different types of speech acts, like assertions, questions, commands. He even critiqued Homer.
Homer, the Iliad and Odyssey guy.
Yep. Protagoras pointed out that the Iliad starts with a command, not a prayer, which he thought was more appropriate for the situation.
Fascinating. So he was a literary critic, too.
And his linguistic work went even further. He came up with categories for grammatical genders, and even suggested that the gender of a word should be changed depending on the meaning.
Aline.
So, for example, he said that the word wrath in Homer, even though it's grammatically feminine, should actually be masculine because, wrath is more associated with men.
Interesting. So was he doing all this linguistic stuff just for fun, or was it connected to his teaching on rhetoric?
Probably both. It's likely that he saw a strong connection between mastering language and being able to argue effectively.
That makes sense.
And, Protagoras was famous for teaching people how to argue on any side of an issue.
Right, that was his big thing. So how did he do that?
Well, it seems he had these handbooks with techniques for argumentation.
Mm.
We know of one called the technique of heuristics, which suggests a focus on, well, argument for its own sake. And there's another one on wrestling, which is thought to be about intellectual wrestling, not physical wrestling.
So like the art of debate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even his famous work, Truth, which contains the man-the-measure doctrine, had an alternative title, Overthrowing Arguments.
Overthrowing arguments. Sounds intense.
And there's this story about Protagoras critiquing a poem by Simonides, trying to show how it's self-contradictory. And apparently the audience was really into it. They were applauding, like it was some kind of performance.
So they turned these intellectual debates into a kind of spectator sport.
That's right. These sophistic debates were a big deal, almost like the athletic competitions at the big festivals. And Protagoras himself was said to have engaged in these verbal contests with all sorts of people, and he even came up with rules for how these contests should be conducted.
So this adversarial approach to argumentation, this intellectual wrestling, as you called it, that was really central to their method.
Yeah, it was.
And this brings us to Protagoras' famous claim that there are two opposing arguments, or logoi, on any matter, and that he can make the weaker argument the stronger.
Right.
So let's talk about that. What did he mean by that?
Well, first of all, we have to consider his views on truth and reality, especially his famous man-the-measure doctrine.
Ah, yes. Man is the measure of all things. What does that even mean?
Yeah.
And how does it relate to these two opposing arguments?
The man-the-measure doctrine is really the starting point for understanding Protagoras.
Yeah.
It's the opening line of his work, Truth.
Okay.
And Plato, in his dialogue, the Theaetetus, interprets this doctrine as a form of subjectivism, the idea that truth is relative to the individual.
So what's true for me might not be true for you.
Exactly. It's all about how things appear to each person. In the dialogue, Socrates uses the example of the wind, how it can feel cold to one person and warm to another.
Right. Makes sense.
So according to this interpretation, my perception is my reality.
Okay, I get that. But doesn't that lead to some problems? Like, if everyone's truth is their own, then isn't everything true?
Yeah, that's the problem Socrates points out in the dialogue. He argues that if every belief is true for the person who holds it, then there's no objective truth at all.
So it's kind of a self-defeating idea.
It can seem that way.
And didn't Aristotle also have something to say about this?
Yes. Aristotle said that Protagoras believed you could affirm and deny anything of anything. And Democritus, another philosopher, argued that Protagoras' view was self-refuting.
How so?
He said that if every appearance is true, then the appearance that not every appearance is true must also be true, which contradicts Protagoras' own idea.
Okay, so there are definitely some logical knots there.
For sure. But Plato actually offers another interpretation of man the measure in the Theaetetus.
Oh, there's another one?
Yeah. This one's about social relativism.
Social relativism. Okay, what's that?
It's the idea that what's right and wrong, what's just and unjust, is relative to the society you live in.
So, like, different cultures have different values.
Right. In the Theaetetus, Socrates says that Protagoras claimed that whatever seems just and honorable to a city is just and honorable for that city, as long as they believe it.
So if a society believes that something is okay, then it is okay, at least for them.
That's the basic idea.
But wait, isn't that completely different from the individual relativism we were just talking about?
You're right. It is different. And that's one of the problems. These two interpretations, individual relativism and social relativism, they don't really fit together.
Right. Because in one, it's all about the individual, and in the other, it's all about society.
Exactly.
And to make things even more complicated, in the same passage where Socrates talks about social relativism, he also mentions that Protagoras had this idea about experts. Experts.
Yeah. Like, in a world where everyone's opinion is equally valid, how can there be experts?
That's a good question.
Well, Protagoras said that even though no one's perception is inherently truer than anyone else's, some perceptions are better than others because they lead to better results.
Okay.
So, like, a doctor can help you be healthy, which is a better state than being sick. And a skilled speaker can persuade a city to make better judgments that will benefit everyone.
So maybe Protagoras wasn't a complete relativist after all.
That's possible. Or maybe his views changed over time. Or maybe he just wasn't always consistent.
Yeah, hard to say for sure.
And it's even more confusing because in Plato's Protagoras dialogue, there's not a lot of explicit relativism. In that dialogue, Protagoras actually presents justice and self-restraint as things that are necessary for any society to function. He doesn't say that they're just, arbitrary customs that happen to be popular in Athens.
So in that dialogue, he seems to be saying that there are some objective moral truths.
That's how it seems. And then there's this later fragment where Protagoras is portrayed as a skeptic. Yeah, he says that we can't even know if he's sitting or standing because different people perceive things differently. But this fragment is probably a later interpretation of his ideas, maybe even a distorted one.
So it seems like Protagoras' views on truth and relativism were pretty complex, and there's still a lot of debate about what he really believed.
Definitely. It's not as simple as some people make it out to be.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about his claim that there are two opposing arguments on every issue? How does that fit into all of this?
Well, given all the inconsistencies with his relativism, it's unlikely that he meant this in a strictly relativist sense.
What do you mean?
If every belief is equally true, either for the individual or for their society, then there wouldn't really be any opposing arguments.
Right, because everything would just be true in its own context.
Exactly. So it seems like he meant something else by this.
So what did he mean?
Maybe he was just saying that on most important issues, there are at least two sides to consider, two different perspectives that you can argue for.
So like two different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, and we have a good example of this in the Dissoi Logoi, a short text from around the same time as Protagoras.
What's the Dissoi Logoi?
It's a text that presents arguments for and against pairs of opposing concepts, like good and bad, just and unjust.
Okay.
And the point of the Dissoi Logoi doesn't seem to be to prove one side right and the other wrong. It's more about showing that there are valid arguments to be made on both sides.
So it's about exploring the complexity of issues.
Exactly. And that's probably what Protagoras meant, too. He was saying that there's always more than one way to look at things.
And what about his claim that he could make the weaker argument stronger? Was he just being a sophist in the negative sense?
Probably not. It's more likely that he was talking about the art of rhetoric, especially in legal and political contexts.
So, like, being a good lawyer or politician.
Yeah. Aristotle, in his Rhetoric, talks about this idea of making the weaker argument stronger. And he says that it's relevant in situations where you don't have definitive proof, where you're arguing about what's probable or plausible.
Okay.
So, for example, imagine a case where a weak person attacks a strong person.
Right.
One side might argue that it's unlikely that the weak person would start a fight.
Makes sense.
Well, the other side might argue that it's unlikely that the strong person would start a fight because they'd know they'd be blamed.
So both sides have a point.
Right. And a skilled rhetorician can use arguments to make one side seem more plausible than the other.
So it's not about manipulating the truth. It's about presenting a case persuasively.
Exactly. And that's probably what Protagoras was claiming. He wasn't saying he could make a false argument true. He was saying he could take a weak argument and make it stronger.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, there's one more thing I want to ask about Protagoras.
Go ahead.
There's this thesis attributed to him, some other sophists, about the impossibility of saying what is false. What's that all about?
Well, this idea goes back to the philosopher Parmenides. Parmenides said that what is not cannot be thought or spoken of.
Okay.
So the argument goes like this. To say something false is to say what is not.
Right.
But anyone who speaks must say something that is. So saying what is not is like saying nothing at all.
So you can't actually say something false.
That's the idea. And it's also connected to the idea that logical contradictions are impossible.
So if I say the sky is green when it's obviously blue, I haven't actually said anything meaningful.
That's the implication. And this thesis is also related to other theories about language that were popular at the time.
Like what?
Well, there was Cratylus, who believed that every object has a correct name that perfectly reflects its true nature. So if you use the wrong name for something, you're not really saying anything at all.
Okay.
And then there was Antisthenes, who said that each thing has a unique definition that can't be applied to anything else, which also leads to the conclusion that falsehood is impossible.
So these were all different ways of saying that you can't actually say something that's false.
Right. But here's the thing. It's hard to reconcile this thesis with Protagoras' other ideas.
Like his relativism.
Exactly. If every belief is true for the person who holds it, then how can falsehood even exist? And the idea of two opposing arguments also seems to imply that one of them could be false.
So there's a bit of a contradiction there.
There seems to be. And the Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out that the attribution of this thesis to Protagoras is a bit shaky. It might have been a more general idea floating around at the time, rather than something he specifically believed.
Okay, so it's a fascinating idea, but maybe not one that Protagoras fully endorsed.
That's probably the best way to look at it.
All right, let's move on to another big debate that the Sophists were involved in. The debate between nomos and physis.
Ah, yes. Law versus nature.
What were their views on that?
Well, this was a huge debate about the foundations of morality and social norms.
Right, like where do our values come from? Are they based on something real, something natural, or are they just made up?
Exactly. And both sides in this debate agreed that nature was the ultimate source of value, the standard for how we should live.
Okay.
But the critics of traditional morality argued that because it was a human invention, it didn't have any real authority.
So they were saying that morality is just a social construct.
In a way, yes. And some of them went even further, arguing that if you could get away with it, you could ignore these social rules.
Like a might makes right kind of thing?
Yeah, something like that. In Plato's Gorgias, there's a character named Callicles who argues that conventional morality is just a way for the weak to control the strong. He says that the strong are naturally entitled to dominate the weak.
Wow, that's a pretty radical view.
It is.
Yeah.
And in the Republic, Thrasymachus says something similar. He admires the ruthless individual, even though he acknowledges that such behavior is considered unjust. And then there's Glaucon, also in the Republic. He has a more nuanced view. He says that moral conventions are necessary for society to survive, but they also hold us back from our true nature, which is basically selfish.
So he's saying that morality is a necessary evil.
In a way, yes. He uses the example of the Ring of Gyges to illustrate his point.
The Ring of Gyges, what's that?
It's a magical ring that makes the wearer invisible. And Glaucon argues that if you had this ring and you knew you could get away with anything, you'd act selfishly, even if you normally considered yourself a moral person.
Interesting. So all of these guys were questioning the authority of traditional morality.
That's right.
But were there any Sophists who defended traditional morality?
Yes, there were. Protagoras, for example, argued that law and morality are natural developments. He said that they're essential for human survival and progress.
Okay.
He acknowledged that they come from our need to cooperate with each other, but he didn't think that they were unnatural or that they stifled our true nature.
So he thought morality was compatible with human nature.
Right. And similar ideas can be found in fragments from Democritus and the anonymous Nyambotai.
And wasn't there also this idea of natural law?
Yes. The idea of natural law, or unwritten law, was very common at the time.
What's that?
It's the idea that there are certain moral principles that are common to all societies, regardless of their specific customs. These principles are often thought to be divine in origin.
Like what?
Things like respecting your parents, honoring the gods, not stealing, things like that.
Okay.
And even Hippias, who we mentioned earlier, is portrayed as believing in natural law.
So it wasn't a simple case of all Sophists being against traditional morality?
No, it was more complicated than that. There was a whole spectrum of views.
That makes sense. Now, another area where the Sophists were often seen as radical was religion.
Right.
What were their views on the gods and religious belief?
Well, in early Greece, people tended to see the cosmos as divine. The early philosophers, like Heraclitus and Anaximander, they saw the universe itself as a kind of god. But in the 5th century, things started to change. There was a shift towards a more naturalistic, a more secular worldview. And the Sophists were part of this shift.
So they were moving away from the idea of a divine cosmos.
Yes. And figures like Anaxagoras, who wasn't strictly a Sophist, but who shared some of their interests, also contributed to this shift.
What did Anaxagoras do?
Well, he famously claimed that the sun was not a god, but a giant red-hot rock.
That must have caused quite a stir.
It did. He was challenging a fundamental belief.
And there's that story about the one-horned ram, right?
Yeah. A soothsayer claimed that the ram's deformity was a sign from the gods. But Anaxagoras dissected the ram's skull and showed that there was a natural explanation for their deformity.
So he was debunking religious interpretations with science.
In a way, yes.
What about the Sophists themselves? Did they have any theories about the origin of religious belief?
They did. Democritus, for example, thought that belief in the gods came from primitive people being afraid of natural phenomena like thunder and lightning. And Prodicus had a couple of theories. He thought that the names of the gods originally referred to things that were essential for human survival, like the sun or crops. Or he thought that they were the names of people who discovered or introduced these things.
So he was basically saying that the gods weren't real.
Well, that's how it was interpreted. He was considered an atheist in ancient times.
And then there's the Sisyphus fragment.
Right. That fragment, which is sometimes attributed to Critias, sometimes to Euripides, presents a very cynical view of religion.
What does it say?
It says that laws were invented to control people's behavior, and then the gods were invented to punish people who broke the laws in secret.
So it's saying that religion is just a tool of social control?
Yeah, it's a pretty strong statement of atheism.
And what about Protagoras? What did he think about religion?
Protagoras famously said, "Concerning the gods, I am not able to know."
So he was agnostic.
Yes. He said that he couldn't know whether the gods existed or what they were like.
And didn't that get him into trouble?
Well, some accounts say that people were so outraged by his statement that they burned his books and forced him to flee Athens.
Wow.
But in Plato's Meno, Protagoras is portrayed as having a good reputation. So maybe the reaction wasn't as extreme as some people say.
And maybe his own view on social relativism helped him avoid too much trouble.
That's possible. If what's right for one city is right for that city, then maybe supporting traditional religion was seen as okay, even if you personally had doubts.
Right. And Protagoras probably also recognized that religion can be useful for society, even if you don't believe in it literally.
Yeah. So overall, his stance on religion was probably pretty pragmatic. And then, of course, there was Hippias, who actually had a more traditional view of the gods. He thought they were the source of natural law.
So once again, we see a variety of views among the Sophists.
Exactly. They weren't a monolithic group.
Okay. So we've talked about their ideas, but the Stanford Encyclopedia entry also points out that the Sophists were like celebrities in their time.
Yeah, they were.
What was their social standing like?
They were very influential. They had wealthy and powerful clients. And they were well paid for their services.
Really?
Plato talks about how much money they made. It was a lot, equivalent to many years' wages for a skilled craftsman.
Wow, so they're doing pretty well for themselves.
They were. And they were also involved in politics.
How so?
Well, Protagoras was asked to write the laws for the new Athenian colony of Thurii. And Gorgias, Hippias, Prodicus, and maybe even Thrasymachus, they all served as diplomats for their cities.
So they weren't just ivory tower intellectuals, they were actively engaged in public life.
That's right.
But their success and influence also made them some enemies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were some people who saw them as a threat.
Like who?
Well, conservative figures like Anytus, who we see in Plato's Meno, they thought the Sophists were undermining traditional morality and religion, and they thought they were corrupting the youth.
So they were seen as a dangerous influence.
By some, yes. And the Stanford Encyclopedia entries suggest that this climate of suspicion, which was also fueled by satirical plays like Aristophanes' Clouds, contributed to the condemnation of Socrates.
Right, because Socrates was accused of being a sophist, even though it wasn't.
Exactly. And Plato, in his attempt to defend Socrates' memory, really went after the Sophists. He portrayed them as these dishonest